I think we should start by whoever has made notes to give very brief reports, as to what happened at these smaller meetings. So start in order. No, what is it, number 4 first?
Yes. I'll try to do this very briefly. The first notion that came up was that there were lots of new ideas that people were hearing, and there was a lot to assimilate. And a person responded to that, trying to really define the problem that this whole seminar is about, to define that problem clearly. And we eventually came to a general sense that self-deception was that problem. But the question was, how could that be dealt with concretely rather than abstractly? And also a question was raised how to answer the question that was put earlier in the seminar, which is, why do we deceive ourselves? We wondered why we had difficulty answering that question. Then someone suggested that maybe insight was our common interest in that group. And sort of as an adjunct to that, there was a suggestion that the real connection was the absence of insight. Then people questioned, do we even know that insight exists? And can we get to insight, if that's what we want to do, by talking about it? And then someone responded to that, is talking only talking, or can talking actually have some value and some purpose? And then following from that, person asked, well, what really is dialogue? Is that part of what we came here for? Is that part of what we can do, dialogue? And the same person further questioned, is the content really so important, or is the process of a dialogue more important, or at least equally important as the content? And that gave rise to questions of individual and collective self-deception, that we do this together as well as privately. Then, pursuing the question of self-deception, people said, we want to find something out, but we only want to look so far, and then we don't want to look any further. We want an answer, but if it seems to be emerging, we tend to shy away from it. And it was suggested that that's from fear of a collapse of the structure that we're used to. And then there was some considerable disagreement as to whether or not we actually knew that that collapse would happen. It wasn't quite clear. Then we sort of went back to the notion, the general notion of what is a dialogue, and asked if people in the group could help one another to expose themselves. We mentioned that there's a great fear of self-exposure, and we asked, is it possible to do that in a friendly way in the small groups or in any sort of group? And the last couple of points were, can we disarm, the term used was disarm, can we disarm our fears in a group discussion?
All right. Shall we start on the next one then?
Yes, I have the next one. And
would you mind coming forward? I don't think we can all hear you.
Sure. I'd just like to say that in the process of doing this, I've had my own wonderful experience with this, because after I got all these notes down, I was trying to make a cohesive whole out of it. And what Lena pointed out to me was that it doesn't have to be that way, that's what my thoughts would do to it. And in fact, all I can do is observe. So these are my notes, which is a little bit of observation. We started out with I'm concluding. We started out with someone asking, how do we resolve the no surrender problem? And then someone said that, someone pointed out that there is something beyond the brain, beyond those two levels of brain, that we can't yet conceive of. what we tend to do is to fall into a trap of repeating what we know. Someone asked, on what level do we hear the questions that we've been asking? And it was also asked, why does the brain go on deceiving itself? And the question also was asked, is it really possible to change? And then we went back to saying that we need to assume that, because otherwise there wouldn't be any point of being here. It seems as if the purpose is to see the way we're functioning, to observe but not act, and that, as Krishnamurti said, to be choicelessly aware. There was an analogy of the way you would feel after a big Thanksgiving dinner, which would be you'd have no energy, and if someone said to you, here come the Russians, you'd say, I don't care, I don't want to think about it. And that we tend to do that with our process of observing. We tend to say, I don't care, I don't want to think about it, I don't have the energy for it. Again, the point of we're not here to act or solve a problem. And someone pointed out that the unknown is uncomfortable. And then we went into discussing the idea of the observer being the observed and the need for attention in that process. That someone said you become what you observe, and so out of that you better be careful what you focus on. The process of observing requires listening and unmotivated attention, and in the process of truly listening, then thinking and judging disappear. The mind is so clever about deceiving oneself. And again, if we're looking at that, our intention is what is important. We are caught in a problem-solving mind. We think things have to go somewhere. We have to accomplish something. Problem-solving and judging. Life goes on with problem-solving and judging. That's what we get caught in, instead of just observing.
And number 3, yes.
Group 6, we had 2 questions that were laid on the table early on. One was, we have many models of what life is and what thought is and what self is. We've heard them many times. How do we know which one is true, and how do we know that these models don't reinforce themselves? That's something like that. Then another idea was laid on the table. Is the ego a fantasy? So then was interested in discussing that for quite a while. People mentioned psychological security. Others mentioned that thought was not enough to break through these kinds of problems. Someone else mentioned that thought, in fact, language, seems to build in certain problems. Like we even have a tendency to say "it rains" when there's no "it raining." Is thought real? Was the question brought up. So we discussed a little bit about what do you mean by real and reality. Someone said that the ego is the thought, that they are equated, that there wouldn't be any, implying there wouldn't be any ego if there wasn't any thought. Then it was introduced that maybe opposites were a good way to look at what thought does. And the most fundamental of opposites, it was suggested, was even in a child, that the me and the not me, those two opposites, were perhaps the first thoughts formed by a person, and they become the most fundamental. Then someone else suggested that their sense of self came as as the totality of all their interactions. And that's how they get their sense of self. And then it was suggested that it was not only the interactions, but the regularity and the constancy that is perceived in interactions. Then the discussion sort of branched out to talk about identity. Is there an identifier when we identify with a nation or an idea or belief? What is this identifier? And then the discussion returned to ego again, ego as habit and ego as belief. So I would say that we spent most of our time in one way or another discussing ego.
Right.
The library group began stating that they felt the inquiry of the weekend was vital.
Was what?
Was vital and important, that the three brains discussion and the possibility of insight change was very important to them. We inquired a little bit into the possibility of how one would even know it, such a change had occurred in the psychological domain, not only in others but in ourselves. What is the difference between an assumption and a perception was brought up, and we discussed whether that could even be verbalized. One lady mentioned that one's daily life seemed to be the best place to start for her, not some kind of abstract effort toward change or achievement. The reason why we're here is to find out, the group seemed to be expressing that the reason that we're here this weekend is to find out why we as individuals are stuck. That there's much suffering, and when one is out of control, it is hard not to fall back on comfortable explanations and goals. And I think one of the last questions that came up was, is it possible to live without aim, direction, or achievement?
Right. Well, perhaps, does anybody want to add anything to this or say anything about it before we? No, yeah. Yes, well, a number of things came up. Now, it seems to me that perhaps it would be useful to say something about dialogue now, which did come up in one or two of the groups. So we have a situation of, where this problem between emotion and intellect arises. Now, there are two ways of approaching that, say individually or in a group, right? Individually, you can begin to give attention to how your thought process is going, to how your assumptions are going and how they affect your emotions. Right? Perhaps I'll say a little about that before we go to dialogue. Right? That see, how can you be aware of the relationship between your assumptions and your reactions? Right? Now, see, ordinarily we're not aware of that. And see, one reason is that if you're doing something based on an assumption, you must accept the truth of that assumption, right? In order to do it. So you're not really questioning it at all. Now, on the other hand, you may simply suppress awareness of the assumption or not be aware of it or forget about it or something. Therefore, also you're not aware of it. That is, you see, if you have a reaction which is produced from an assumption and you can't see both together, then you don't see the main point. Is that clear? No. Right. Well, look, suppose I say, let's go into it. You've got anger or hurt, right? Now, somebody says something to you and you react, right? So why do you react? Can you picture that. You see, so why do you get angry or why do you get hurt?
Well, you might feel that their anger is unjustified, that you don't deserve it. They misinterpreted what you did.
Yeah, you can feel that you've been badly treated. People are pushing you around. They're not really respecting you. They're not treating you properly. They're not giving you due importance. You see, but then behind that are assumptions, right?
You're not supposed to do that.
Yes, the assumption is that I need to be treated in a certain way, right? And I need people to say certain things to me. That if they say these things to me, then I feel generally pleased, right? And secure. So there's a connection between what I think people are saying, or what they may be actually saying, and the way I feel. And that's sort of in the background. You've got used to that, and you're probably not really aware of it. And then suddenly somebody says the opposite. You see, saying, you're not doing right. You're not really. You're not independent. You have to do what I say. I don't really care what you want. It's what I want that counts. And so on. Now, that if you produce an opposite assumption, you will therefore produce an opposite feeling, right? Is that clear? If you have got used to feeling good because of satisfying one assumption, the removal of that will produce a bad feeling, right? Or especially if you bring in the opposite, right? The opposite thought will produce the opposite feeling. At first, the mind the emotion, the old brain reacts in that way, but gradually, it gets you sort of build up. You repeat it, and so you begin to impose it. Right? You say you've got used to the good assumption, and you see, at first it may give you a lot of pleasure to think that you're doing all right, and so on. The second time a bit less. The third time a bit less. So the spontaneous reaction of the emotions has sort of died away, but it's continually being imposed. And you're used to that, right? Now suddenly that mechanism for imposing the good feeling doesn't have the right assumption to feed it, right? But it gets the opposite assumption, so it will impose the opposite feeling. Right? But we don't see that. Either that is concealed or just simply not noticed, right? You see, the connection between the two brains anyway is not very aware, at best. We're not very aware of how the new brain and the old brain are connected, right? But then we may also conceal it, right? Because you can get more pleasure by concealing the connection between the assumption and the pleasure, right? If you know that you're getting pleasure just by thinking about it, it's not very significant, right? But if that's concealed, then the pleasure can be assumed to be arising from a deep emotion, having great significance. Is that clear? And therefore, but then when the pain comes through instead, that will also have great significance. It will be very painful. See, the more efficient you are at producing a pleasure-generating mechanism, the more efficient it will be also a pain-generating mechanism, or a fear-generating mechanism. So, but that's not seen. You see, the connection between the assumption and the reaction is not seen, and also the other way around. That pleasure contains an urge or a demand, or the need to maintain assumptions that sustain the pleasure. Right? That's where the self-deception comes in, right? So now the main point is that the connection is not seen. You see, it seems that the thoughts are on one side, and are going on some ethereal realm, and what's going on in the body is on the other side, entirely separate. Is that any clear? Any questions on that?
Here's one. I don't want to interrupt you at this point.
Yeah.
But I found it helpful in this connection about the assumptions that what helped me it was in the last number of years was I do not act on the feeling.
Yeah.
Then the assumptions are easier to see.
Right.
Not acting has been very helpful.
Yes, well, that really was the point I wanted to come to, but you see that it's good to be confirmed this way. You see, the point is that if you act on the assumption, then you must be accepting it. You can't be questioning it, right? If you repress consciousness of it, you don't know anything about it, right? But if you are letting the action come out, but not actually carrying it out all the way, so suspending it. Therefore, you can now notice the whole body is being stirred up, all the emotions in the body, and you can see that it's coming from the assumptions, from the words, from the assumptions, from the meaning.
It becomes a experience.
What?
Before it would become a experience.
Yeah. Therefore, you begin to get some perception of what's going on. You see, and that's an important point to be able to see the connect. You see, it's part of our culture and part of the whole even almost of the structure of the brain that this is rather hard to see, right? And it gets even harder because our culture is so set up as to not merely use the fact that it's hard to see, but actually to conceal it, right? By in many ways. You see, by first of all denying there's any connection. Saying it's not something else, or else by suddenly forgetting about it, or if you happen to see it, or by jumping to something else, you see, not staying on the point. In other words, you're incapable of holding attention on the point. Anything that would interrupt this pleasure prevents attention, right? To that point. So, therefore, there seems to be a mechanism for concealing this connection. Now, it conceals a lot of other things too, but this connection, conceal this connection is really very crucial.
I might just add that it just sort of confirms this thing that you're saying, that we don't perceive the connection. Frequently, psychotherapists and psychoanalysts are making interpretations to patients about what is the connection between their thought and their feeling. They may or may not be right, but they're making these interpretations. And even if they're fairly well on the target, it's very difficult for the patient to see the connection. And this is one of the things that the psychoanalytic people are always talking about, that in order for their patients to improve, there has to be a connection between what the thought and the feeling, and they're always deploring the fact that it's so hard for patients to do this. And they're always, well, not always, but very frequently, they're kind of chastising their patients almost, because the patients aren't doing it. And you're saying, you've got to feel it in your guts, you've got to be aware of it, and the poor patient doesn't know, what on earth the guy's talking about.
Yes, well, I don't know if then if people know what is being talked about here. Then, shall we talk about it?
Do you feel that there's, well, first of all, there's also the non-pleasure feeling that I would imagine is also based on an assumption, which
Yes.
we tend to keep stable also.
Yes.
But the other question I want to ask is, do you think that all emotional reaction is based on an assumption?
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily. No, you see, the emotions, on one hand, may be the first response to the perception of reality. You see, if you think of the structure of the nervous system, a lot of the stuff comes through the spine into the base of the brain, the emotional center, and then goes on up into the higher into the cortex. Now, so that there may be a kind of emotion which is the first indication of a deep perception, right? But then there's another kind of emotion which is not, but which is rather mechanically the result of assumptions. But because of concealing that connection, a further assumption is readily made that the two are the same.
What is it that delineates the difference between an assumption and a perception?
Yes. Well, that's a long story. But you see, most perceptions that we have will contain assumptions, but like if I say this is a chair or something, but it's not entirely based on, on some thought process, right, on the past, right? You see, I would like to say a little bit about the thought process now. I think we can put the thought process in terms of the word to posit, which is saying position, place, right, to put, right, to place. Now, thought is a kind of positing, but now we say that there are a great many words in our language which show this. See, suppose I say the first step is to propose a thought, right, to put it forth for exploration, discussion, right? Now, then it can be composed, put together into concepts. But then you suppose it to be right. That's the assumption, right? Suppose means put it under. It means you're acting as if that were the ground, right? On which you stand. You act as if it were true. Now that's a crucial step. You see, until it's been assumed to be so, the thought is capable of being looked at, and all sorts of things can be done with it. But once it's assumed to be so, it becomes active on its own. Because out of the assumption arises, first of all, a disposition, to dispose. Your body is disposed, the whole system, to act accordingly. So if you assume that a road is level on a dark night, your body is disposed to trust it, but finding out it's not, you change, right? You can think of the disposition of the army, the commander, to put his troops in a certain way, if it's the right, because he is assuming the enemy to be coming from that way. It may not, right? Now then, so this disposition is immediately the result of a supposition or an assumption, but the disposition is not conscious. Right? It just acts. So when you have made an assumption, you have committed yourself to a disposition, right? And also to a way of looking, because under the assumption that something is so-and-so, this disposes you to see it that way, right? Your enemy or friend, or the shadow in the dark night as an assailant. If you assume it's an assailant, you will see an assailant, right? Assuming it's not you. You see, so the way you see it, the way you act, and so on, come out of an assumption, right? Now, from there on, you can say this will work up to a point, but it may cease to work. Then you can now say that you have opposition, right, from the environment. And then what are you going to do? Well, one approach is, we'll call it exposition, to expose the assumption, put it out, right, to look at it. Or the other is imposition, that is to impose the assumption in spite of the evidence, right, which we've discussed too here. Now, so you see, that's the whole process. If it's exposed, then you've got to go back to the beginning and perhaps propose another assumption, or propose something else, explore. So where does the proposal come from? See, the thing, I'm saying the origin, I'm discussing the order in which thought unfolds, right? It originates, I say it basically, it originates in the form of proposal. Then it goes through all these stages. Is that clear? So where does thought, the origin of thought, we're close to the origin of thought when we discuss proposals, right? Putting forth but where do the proposals come from? You see, you must perceive something. You see, you may get proposals just by shuffling your memory around, and so like playing around with old thoughts, right? But you also begin by saying, I actually see something, say, through the senses, right? And I say, I propose that that is a shadow, right? Right? Or it is an assailant, right? Or something else. But I must have something happening which is not merely the result of the previous thought, which I call perception. But obviously, thought, the proposal enters in to give meaning to the perception and so on, and shape it, and to carry it into action. So you have all that going on, and now we have perception through the senses, which I've just described, and but also perception through the mind, right? Because I can see, if I've said all this, right, have you been looking at it through the mind? Paying attention to it. So paying attention is something beyond assumption, right? Is that clear? See, so it's possible to pay attention to the senses or to pay attention to how thought is working or to how the mind is working and all sorts of things, right? So somehow attention is not caught in assumptions. Now, it may get caught in assumptions, then you're very limited, you see. But if your attention is caught according to your assumption, you can't really see, right? That often happens.
Isn't that more the case than not?
It may be more the case than not, but it isn't necessary.
Being aware that it isn't necessary, is that sufficient to...
What?
Is the awareness that it isn't necessary, is that statement sufficient to change the action?
No, we're merely discussing the structure now of thought, you see, and saying that we have... See, the point is that one of the main reasons for discussing this structure is that we already have other assumptions about this structure, you see, which are in the culture. So therefore, this helps you to be aware of the other assumptions, and I suspect that it's a more accurate sort of structure than the one that is usually in the culture.
Are those two distinct ways thought originates? Senses or attention? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you have to give attention always, anyway, even to the senses, but it may come through the senses, or you may give attention to the senses, or you may give attention to the mind, right? Or both. Right? And now, a new proposal, which is really, can only come by giving attention. You see, first of all, sufficient attention to see that the old assumptions are not adequate. You see, I don't think you can, by assumption, prove that an old assumption is inadequate. You see, I can't assume that my assumptions are inadequate. I mean, there'd be something wrong with that. But I say I can perceive that they are inadequate, and I'm implying thereby that perception is a sort of a more subtle process than thought.
It's easier to accept from your family or from the culture that we do these things and we don't do those things. No, this is sort of automatic. We haven't given it really any much thought, certainly no perception. Is that the idea that you say that actually perceiving it is a much more complicated process?
Well, I don't know if it's complicated, but it's more subtle and it's deeper, you see. That is, thought is a bit more superficial. It's more fixed and it's more on the outside, right? Now, but thought is necessary. We have to make proposals and assumptions and dispositions, you see, and so on to act, right? But we then get caught in them because we start to defend the assumptions, or vice versa, the assumptions defend themselves, in the way we discussed before. And therefore, when there's opposition, we don't expose the assumptions, we don't allow the exposing of the assumptions, but we impose them, right? Though they may be wrong. Now you see, assumptions may be good up to a point and then they not, right? Like Newton's theory was based on assumptions that hold at low velocities, at higher velocities compared with light. Einstein's assumptions replace that. So there, as far as we know, there are no assumptions that would hold forever, no matter what happens, right? There's always some uncertainty as to how far an assumption will hold. But some are more certain than others, clearly. Like if you assume the sun will rise, that's reasonably tomorrow. Reasonably, it's pretty certain, but it's always possible something would happen.
We can operate more efficiently if we hang loose on the assumptions a little
If
bit.
we what?
Kind of hang loose on the assumptions.
Yeah, we don't hold them too tightly. You see that? So that's important. If you assume absolute necessity, then you will not yield on the assumptions, right? The assumptions will not yield themselves. It's not but up to... So you don't do it. You see that our language says you are doing it, right? It says it is raining, huh? But there's no it that's raining, right? It's just raining. And there may be a you, but it isn't doing this. You see, the assumption, that's the process, right? The assumption unfolds into a disposition which affects action, perception, right? And when there is opposition, either it is exposed or imposed, right? Now that happens as a result of the process itself. It is not that you look into there and then decide what to do, right? You don't decide, once you assume the road is level, you don't decide to dispose of your body, right? It disposes itself.
But you do decide to expose.
You do, but you really, that probably, it's not clear whether you do, because, some further assumptions may force you to impose.
It seems like you impose as long as the opposition from the environment's not too great. Or even if it is great, you may continue to impose, but something else has to be called forth to actually choose to expose.
Well, is it a choice or is it a perception of the need to expose, you see?
But it's still something from outside of your thought enfolding side.
It's outside the thought, but is it you? Or what will we mean by saying it's you, right? You see, it's something more subtle than thought, more deeper, and maybe faster.
I remember a story that you told when you were a little boy trying to run across a pond over stones and trying to think ahead as to how to do it, and that the process was too slow for you to do it. It wasn't at that moment. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Is the story correct one? And what we seem to be doing now is slowing this process down to a very slow level so that we can see the steps.
Yeah. And that's right. And that means we're suspending the action that would follow from the process. You see, if we are talking very fast with each other, because of each one is really trying to impose his thought on the group, right? Because he can't help it. You see, we're not blaming anybody. It's just the very nature of that thought that it wants to impose, right?
But making it personal, isn't that what's going on just within ourselves, even if there is no group?
Yeah, it happens individually, but it happens in a group in the same way. You see, so one of the requirements of dialogue is that we be aware of this so that we don't impose it on ourselves and we don't impose it in the group, right? You see, so that it can be suspended. It means a slower response, giving time for assimilation of everything, and giving other people time to come in so they don't feel under pressure. See, then they feel that something is being imposed on them and they've got to get in there, impose their view first, right? So that's the sort of, you begin to see how these questions are involved in socially and individually, right?
Are you saying that the stuff of thinking is assumptions occasionally modulated by perception? Where do we put facts, for example?
Well, the fact comes really from the discovery that the assumption is not working. That's the main fact. You see, we do get facts saying the assumption is working, right? And then suddenly we get a perception that it's not working.
So perception works generally on assumptions, not necessarily on facts?
What is a fact? You see, the word fact means to make, right, in Latin, manufacture. Right? It really means what is made or what is done. You see, a fact has to be established, right? You may say this is a fact, but you're not really sure. Unless it stands up to a lot of tests, you're not sure it's a fact, right? In science, you may often have to test it many times before you say it's a fact, right? But the fact in science is that certain assumptions have been verified, assumptions about the laws of physics, right? So, see, a more limited fact is that you got a certain number out of an experiment, but that doesn't mean very much. See, the fact is inseparable from what it means. You see, an interesting fact is one that would mean something, right? If I say here, is whatever it is, it's a fact, but, not very significant. And even that could be some sort of mistake. You see, you have to, perhaps you would have to check it, right? So, fact, I think, see, it depends on how we use language, but see, facts don't exist sort of out there. Say they don't come along and say, I'm a fact, or this is a fact, right?
Because when you said the Newton's theories, assumptions, Einstein theories, assumptions, but to some degree...
They are verified.
They are verified. Now, are there then different stuff of thinking which are facts and solidly, absolutely so, or we always deal with assumption to some degree?
Well, that's a question we have to go into. At least under ordinary conditions, that's what we're doing, I see. As far as life in society is concerned, and all that we're doing, we're dealing with assumptions which have been confirmed up to a point and which may hold up to a point and not further. Right? But we may want them to hold forever, and therefore we're looking for absolute certainty, which is a serious mistake, right?
When we enter into a dialogue or a relationship with another individual, and we have a whole set of assumptions about that individual that, unbeknownst to us, I would imagine, or I'm wondering if those assumptions keep that individual in those assumptions. In other words, it doesn't let them have a chance to be something else.
I mean, can you put it, I don't quite get it.
Well, you say, okay, he always gets mad if you say such
Oh,
and
yeah.
such. You know, you have something built in.
Yeah, that's an interesting assumption, you see, because not merely, I say he got mad a number of times, which would be a fact, you know, the only assumption there is that I remember it correctly, right, which is not always true. But, so one fact might be he got angry quite a few times, right? Then perhaps twice. Then I make the assumption he always gets angry.
Yeah.
Right? Well, that changes the whole picture radically, you see, because then he is a person who it becomes an absolute necessity that he'll get angry, right? Because if he's always angry, he's necessarily angry. He cannot be otherwise, and that is an unyielding quality, you know, and therefore he's an angry man, you see. That's his quality, right? Therefore I see him that way. And I'm disposed to him that way, and say I expect him to get angry, and I have a somewhat hostile disposition myself, and that will encourage him to get angry, right? They're apparently confirming my assumption. So, and that way you get an assumption that fulfills itself, right?
We looked carefully at thought, its beginning, and how it worked out. Could you say something about perception in that same sense, where it comes from?
Yeah, that's a much deeper question, you see. I think, you see, thought, we don't know exactly where it comes from, but at least we can sort of trace out its steps, right? Now, perception must come, I think, from something much deeper. And perhaps I'll call it ultimately creative intelligence, right? Now, suppose I say that for some mysterious way creative intelligence is working, but thought has to be able to respond to it where we need thought, right? If thought is rigid, has made assumptions of absolute necessity, it can't, right? Therefore, creative intelligence cannot work from when there are assumptions of absolute necessity. If you say the thought must be able to play, you say, to move around, to play, to try to capture the perception. Right? The very word perception comes from the word capture, perceive, to hold thoroughly, to capture. Right? So the point is that thought must be sensitive and able to move around freely. So we could say that the proposal should be a kind of play, right? It's clear if you're making proposals, you're not actually doing anything, you're merely playing with thought, right? Now, when you make an assumption, then you have begun to affect what you do. Now, you have play. Now, you see, we don't really like to recognize in our culture that thought originates in play. See, we do admit that it does when it's bad thought. You see, we have the three words illusion, delusion, and collusion based on ludere to play. they're all forms of bad thought, false, deceptive thought, right? I mean, illusion is and delusion are thought playing false in certain ways, and collusion, people play false together, right? Now, so we say play is all right when it's, we'll recognize play when it's false in our language, but we have no word which says thought plays true, right? You see, it's part of the work ethic, perhaps, that part of the assumptions in our society are that, that thought is a rather serious business, very heavy and weighty, and really play is rather light, or maybe it's recreational, or it might be frivolous. And really, when you're thinking, you've got, you can't be that way, right? But you see, play, if children are at play, it seems that they could be quite serious. You see, they're learning in some way. And see, so the origin of thought has to contain a kind of play, a free play. If it can't do that, then it will not be able to respond to creative intelligence. That's what I'm suggesting. So there has to be that sort of sense of play at the origin of thought, right? Now, but if you have assumptions of absolute necessity, it's rigid there.
But you can have assumptions. That's part of the play.
Yeah, you play at assuming too, right?
Right.
Yeah, you hold them lightly or as heavily as you need to, but saying it could always be changed, right?
Yes.
So the play can extend on from the proposal to the concept to the assumption, and so on to the disposition. But some of them are so confirmed that you accept them and take them for granted, but it's wrong if they get so rigidified that they cannot go back and play. See, but if you say you belong to a certain religion or a certain nation, you simply cannot play with notions which would contradict the doctrines of that religion or the values of that nation, right? You see, not merely that you are not allowed to do otherwise, but you find the kind of pressure created that you can't play. You're disposed to be rigid.
Well, I've heard play described as activity for its own sake. Would you change that?
Well, it could be for its own sake, yes, but at the same time, it may have another purpose too. You see that out of it may emerge something more, right?
Well, the possibility of creativity.
Yeah. So play is learning, you see, play is, out of play may appear new proposals, new assumptions, and so on.
Mostly keeping yourself open and flexible, for one thing, I suppose. Open and flexible and having a good time with it instead of merely going round on one position.
Yes, you see, it may get very grim and heavy, and you see, and then you begin to worry. See, am I doing this right? You see, what? You see, you could say, am I dealing properly with assumptions? You see, and you begin to get very heavy about it. Right? Or am I playing properly? You see. Am I relaxing? You see, what should I do to relax? You see, we get caught in that, and it's in the culture, you see. Especially in this culture, which emphasizes the work ethic so hard, right?
Am I jumping ahead a little here? What's the relationship between creative intelligence and insight?
Well, I'd say they're very closely related. You see, I mean, creative intelligence is a sort of a more continuing activity. Insight we usually think of as a flash of some sort, but creative intelligence sustains the meaning of that flash, right? In all life, right? So it's artificial to separate them.
Okay, that's what I want to know.
Mm-hmm. See, so I won't discuss that now, but we could try to say what is intelligence to, you see, just this would tie up with what we're talking about, because now I like to discuss the derivations of words. I say they're something like the archaeology of our thought process. They give some perception of how our thoughts originated, so what they used to be anyway. And You see, there are three words: select, collect, and intellect. You see, now the word select is based. They're all based on legere Latin, meaning to gather. Select means to gather apart. Collect, to gather together. And intelligence is based on interlegere, meaning to gather from in between. You see, so if you're going to make concepts, you gather all the instances together and say select, right? All the things that belong in that word, right? You collect all those together and separate them from the other, from the background first, right? You select all the objects that belong, say all the chairs you see in your mind, or select other objects such as tables, but they are collected in that very act and one group, and they are distinguished from the others, right? So select is to gather it apart from the whole, and also to gather it together, right? Collect. But intelligence is based on another notion, which is to gather. See, if you have well-formed concepts, then you select according to your past assumptions, right? But in intelligence, you gather, therefore you are gathering in a well-formed way. In intelligence, you gather from in between all those, right? It's not fixed, right? You form new concepts. Is that clear? You see, Newton, our previous concept selected everything on earth and put it under one heading, everything in the heaven and put it under another heading. It collected everything. It selected those and collected them together. Up in heaven it selected another set, right? It said heavenly matter, earthly matter. Now then, but there was evidence that this way of doing it wasn't really right. That's sharp separation. And so Newton's perception could have been to say what? That we're no longer selecting from in that rigid way, but heavenly and earthly matter are sort of put together, and we're selecting in some other way from in between, right? According to how fast things are falling or something. Is that so? You see, intelligence is the constant creation of new kinds of thought, right? It allows for that. And intellect is the past participle of intelligence. It's what has been gathered. So you could say intellect is the faculty of dealing with what is known, right? Right? Whereas it's the crystallization of intelligence. But intelligence is the very act of perception itself. Right? Which is ultimately created, right? So therefore, but intelligence is sustained. It's not just one flash of insight, but this intelligence is sustained in all that you do, right? You're constantly open to new ways of seeing.
It's always preceded by insight, by the flash.
Well, the flash, you see, I think that it's when some very unusual perception occurs, we call it insight, right? But intelligence we're part of that same movement. That if there were not intelligence, it would not be much a point to having an insight, right? It must sustain the activity from the flash, right? Like Newton had the flash of earthly and heavenly matter, but then he had to sustain it in a whole series of steps, right?
What do you call a new thought? Is there in the flash of insight new thought born, or is it that, as we just said before, we in a playful way get a lot of thoughts together, a lot of concepts together? Maybe when Newton did that he knew all about the previous ideas, he brought it together, maybe in a playful way, and then in between, the flash occurred, rearranging already existing thoughts.
Either way is all right. You see, in some cases you bring together playfully things that you know, and in other cases you begin to break up the things that you know and reorganize them in new ways. You see.
But is there such a thing as new thought, genuinely new thought?
Well, perhaps not, but we'll say there's a proposal which is not rigidly attached to the previous assumptions, right? You see, that thought which emerges from this movement, which is not rigidly attached to fixed assumptions, See, the fixed assumption contains a disposition to hold that thought, right? To hold the assumption itself, and to prevent a new proposal, to prevent you playing, right? So therefore, if we say that it loosens up, if all this begins to loosen up, then play can occur, and either you can rearrange thoughts that you know, or you can sort of begin to dissolve your old thoughts and put them together in new ways, right? Now, so that suggests that at the core, at the origin of thought, is this process. Then it gets, by means of assumptions, it gets more and more crystallized and rigid. And habits, the assumptions become habitual and so on.
When Einstein, I think this book had been his first one, but he imagined himself traveling as fast as light, and seeing how is it then? If you travel as fast as light, what have you got? Now, would this be part of the playfulness?
Yes, he's playing around with concepts, you see. He saw that there was something that looked very strange when he did that, right? That he said if you, for example, move with a light beam and you have a mirror in front of you, you would never see your image in the mirror because the light would never get it out of you to reach the mirror, right? So this seemed striking to him, and he said that really was a kind of insight that implied the theory of relativity, a great deal of it. And if you go into it, you see that. But you see, what he was doing then was playing with thought. You see, saying, people ordinarily assume that you can, if there's any kind of a wave movement, you could imagine yourself overtaking it, going the same speed, and then overtaking it, right? So he said there would be something strange about overtaking a light beam, right? So he was playing with thought here, whereas ordinarily you would say, I assume that in any case you can always overtake any movement whatsoever, and therefore I fix my thought, right? I can't play with that anymore.
Is playing with thought or fantasizing? It's two different.
Well, fantasy could be one form of play with thought, but you see there's two kinds of fantasy, there's two kinds of imagination then, you see. There's that kind of fantasy which is controlled by assumptions. It isn't really play. It may look like play, but it's not. Usually, you see, when you have terrifying fantasies or pleasing fantasies, there are usually assumptions behind it.
Or having a fantasy of a big enlightenment.
Well, that also will give pleasure. There's an assumption behind it that it gives you pleasure and so on. So the fantasy would be in the component of the imagination which accompanies the thought. You see, in Einstein's case, he had some deep thought which we can't verbalize, and he put it into the fantasy of moving with the light wave, right?
Mm-hmm. We can say that the fantasy relies on a past thought.
Yes, but it also may allow to play and allow new thoughts to appear.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. You see, so I would prefer to call it imagination. You see that by imagining that he was moving with the light ray, he was exploring a new thought. Mm-hmm. Now, a different thought, you see, from what had been explored before. So so it seems to me that one of the important points is that this, at the core of thought, the origin, it has to loosen up, you see, without these fixed assumptions, right? Of absolute necessity.
I'm still puzzled by this word origin. At the core of thought, insight, creative intelligence. In what sense is that intelligence creative? If its manifestation and input into this world is at the core of thought, is there anything new under the sun in the sense that are there really genuinely new thoughts, or as you said, I think yesterday or some other time, Einstein had all the facts already ready, available. Actually, it was all around. And then this reconfiguration of things, looking at it some different way, occurred.
Yeah, but I think we must distinguish between creativity and novelty. There may be something new in creativity, but novelty by itself is not creative, right, necessarily.
Right.
So that would take some discussion. I think we perhaps would say we're reaching a point of having our break soon. See, perhaps we'll put that aside for a while. But just remember that creativity is not necessarily the same as novelty, though it may include novelty. It also includes other things. And but now I'm really saying that creativity may go beyond thought. It may do all sorts of things which are not in thought and so on. But I'm just discussing how it may manifest in thought. Right? And that is very important, because if we are going to be if we don't do this, our thought is going to be mechanical. Our whole action, since our disposition is controlled by that thought, our action is going to be mechanical, right? And therefore life will be mechanical if it is not creative. Now, one of the main things that makes life mechanical is our thought. We have got to use thought in all sorts of activities in life, you see. We can't just stop. We may have an area where we stop thinking, but then when we actually are going to work together and do things, we're going to have to employ thought, right? And that thought may be mechanical, which means we'll be stuck in the mechanical, or it may not be mechanical. Right? It may be free play at the origin. Right? The reason I call it the origin is that I say that the proposal is where the thought basically originates. Then it's put together, composed, and then it's supposed or assumed, and so on down the line, right? So I say you can follow an order of unfoldment or generation of thought, right? And therefore, we have got to, if we don't look at this way thought is going, it's going to dominate us, because once you make an assumption, thought takes power, right? The assumption is what gives thought real power. See, this will be relevant to the question of where does the ego get its power, you see. Any assumption gives power to thought. It produces a disposition, you see.
Yet without it there is no action.
Yes, well, thought cannot produce action except by an assumption. Right? Now, therefore, the minute it's accepted as an assumption, power has been given to it. Right? If it's assumed to be absolute necessary, absolute power has been given to it. Right? It will sweep aside everything. It will resist everything. Right? Therefore, if you are now dominated by it. You see, thought has set something in motion. You have allowed something to get going in motion, which will now come back to you as something too powerful to do anything about, right? You see, so you have to be careful. Thought has power. Thought takes power. And it gets power through assumption, but before it reaches assumption, it's at the stage where it can be play. It has no power at that stage, right? It is then simply something you're playing with. Right, I think we'll take a break now. Yeah, well, we've been discussing in the general structure of thought, really, the order in which it operates and all that, and how it takes power, right? See, the important point is that the ego does not give power to thought, but thought takes power on its own, right? And it may give power to the ego instead. We'll perhaps come to that. So, see, if you can once understand that thought takes power, then that may explain the power that the ego seems to have. But we'll perhaps leave that for a later occasion. Eh? Now, and now, we're saying that in trying to do something about this, you see, at least in a very preliminary way, you can try to be aware of the connection between the assumption and the disposition of the body, of the emotions, right? How the whole body feels, that the whole body may be under tension, the breathing is affected, the solar plexus, the eyes, everything by the thought, right, by the assumption. So but that is being concealed. That it's first of all rather hard to see at best, but it is probably because you have, because the two brains are not that well integrated. But in addition, there's a whole process of concealment, which we said was aimed at increasing the pleasure, but would also increase the pain, right? Now, then, so the first point is, as an individual, it's possible to suspend your action when you react, when you're angry or hurt or frightened. And say, I'm interested in seeing what's going on with this reaction, with fear, with anger, with hurt. Right? That it's more important to see what's going on than to settle the issues which are in that anger, right, or fear, right? And that's the approach to the individual, through paying attention to all that, right? And that attention gives rise to a perception. Let's say, for the sake of argument, creative intelligence can see, and the thought can change, right? Perhaps the creative intelligence would operate over the whole brain rather than over some part, right? Now, so it would enable the whole brain to understand what's going on. Now, the other approach is when we're together, you see, in dialogue. Now, I was already saying that in order to be able to communicate properly, we have got to have this somewhat of an attitude of not rushing in. Not the assumptions are what drive us, take power and drive us to answer right away. Is that clear? What kind of assumptions? Can you see? I mean, do you see the assumptions that do that?
Are you asking what kind of assumptions we have?
Which do that?
That's a necessity.
For what, though?
That we know the
To
answer.
know.
Right.
What?
To be right.
To be important.
Yeah, and
That we know the answer.
to get it across and so on.
Right.
And therefore, that assumption creates the disposition to get in right away. And also, since everybody's doing it, you feel under pressure to get in even faster. And that prevents a dialogue. Right? You see, because when that happens, people can't really be listening to each other and can't really be, communicating properly and so on. But there's more to a dialogue than, the dialogue does involve the suspension of that impulse, right? And therefore some awareness of that impulse, of how the assumption is giving rise to the impulse.
Is there always an assumption when you have an impulse to interrupt somebody?
Not necessarily, but it very often is, right?
Right, sure.
I mean, we have to then find out, is it an assumption? You see, if it's happening all the time, or most of the time, then it probably is an assumption, right?
Could be.
Yes, but I meant if people generally are just trying to get in very fast, then you could say that's an assumption which is communicated from one person to the other. Right? It's like a communicable disease. Right? You see, that you can say between assumptions and a disease, we could make an analogy, because in a way the virus is a kind of information, it's a kind of assumption as to what should happen, and which gets into the cell DNA and makes the cell produce more virus, you see, instead of cell protein. And see, the assumption gets into the thought process or consciousness and makes it produce all sorts of wrong results if it's too rigid, and also it continues to spread the assumption, right? To other people, and and in yourself.
Like an epidemic.
Right, epidemic.
A disease, epidemic.
Yeah. So you have this problem, it's sort of communicable. And you see, in other words, if one person starts doing it wrong, it becomes communicable. Right?
Is the reverse?
It may work out the reverse too. You see, that the communication of a better way is also possible. So, anyway, now a dialogue, you see, I say what we've been having is, or at least not entirely so, perhaps it was the beginning of a dialogue, but in general it starts out as a discussion, right? And we said the word discussion has the same root as percussion or concussion. It has the idea of some sort of hitting something. It's like a ball being hit back and forth, right? Ping pong. So you're saying in a discussion where we might, in a good discussion, we would be passing the subject back and forth like a ball, right? And that has its value. You see, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but there's something else, something much deeper and possible in a dialogue. That is, in a discussion, we might be aiming either at being informed or at convincing somebody of the truth of our views, or persuading them, or or something, right? But in a dialogue, the aim is quite different. You see, now the word dialogue is based on a Greek word, dia, meaning through, and logos, the word. But obviously, it doesn't mean the word only, but the meaning, right? Logos also means intelligence. It means meaning of the word and all that. It's not just the sound. So so we could say that in a dialogue, we have meaning passing through the group, like a stream flowing, right? So we're all connected by participating, by being in contact with that stream, right?
And it's a verb, dialegome.
Yeah, yes. I don't know how you would translate it, but...
Yeah, it means I am going... Legome is the verb of the logos.
Yeah.
It's like I'm going through.
Yeah.
But the whole organism.
Yeah, we're going through the meaning, right?
Yeah.
You see, but I think that ultimately it's speculated intelligence has the same root as logos. You see, Ojai in Latin and logos in Greek, but you have then that we are going to have a sort of a stream flowing through. Say we're all islands in the stream, you see, rather than thinking we're passing a ball back and forth. And obviously, if we're going to do that, we are going to have to slow down, give room for everybody to come in and so on, to assimilate what is meant, right? And all that. So now, you see, usually when people are having a communication, see, each one has his own assumptions, which constitute his point of view, right? They determine his point of view. And he's holding to those assumptions, hoping to persuade or convince somebody else that his is right, or to get them to adopt his assumptions. Now, in a dialogue, we are suspending those assumptions, whether yours or mine. Is that clear? So, the same as we are suspending that urge to jump in, we are also suspending the assumption. You see, we are not necessarily acting from that assumption. We're not, we let it come out so we can see what it is, but we don't. It doesn't act so powerfully that we are going to defend it, right? You see, because if you say an assumption is true, then you'll be disposed to defend it, right? And if you say it's absolutely true, then you would defend it all, to the death, right? So so in this dialogue, we are all, if we manage to have it, we are all able to listen and to hold these different assumptions together in the mind. It's in suspension, right? Which in a way means we're not assuming them. But they're really being treated as proposals. We're able to look at them and play with them rather than, being compelled to defend them and carry them out. Now, that has a place. You see, there's a place for assuming something and carrying it out. We can't make the whole of life a dialogue, right? In that sense of suspending assumptions all the time. But there must be some room for a dialogue, right, in life. You see, now a dialogue of that sort would have to have no fixed purpose and no fixed task. See, every task is based on an assumption as to what is the task, and other assumptions go with it, right? As to, a great many assumptions enter into any definition of a task, right? Now, if you say, we've got to solve this problem, that's the first requirement, then the assumptions behind the problem cannot be suspended, right? Because we have said that problem is the fact, that is what we have to work with. We assume that is the problem, right? But suppose it's not the problem. See, somebody may think that something else is more important, but it's restricted. You see, the thought that this is the problem has taken power, and you can't break into it, right? You may have a group which does have a problem. That was what it does, but in a dialogue group, it would be better not to have a problem, right? Not fixed, right? You may discuss all sorts of problems, but you don't necessarily have to solve them, right? Is it beginning to be clear that this is a rather different way for operating of the mind, of thought, right? Of that way,
It's very similar as we thought before. When one doesn't act out from anger, it waits. So it's similar in a dialogue. One doesn't act out right away, but wait.
Yes, to suspend, but be observant while you suspend. You see, that is to pay attention. But if you're by yourself, you're primarily paying attention to the way your body is tensed up by an assumption, right? So to be aware of both of the assumption and the effect, right? Now in a dialogue, it seems it's much richer because it's happening to a large number of people all at once. You can be aware of how everybody is moving, and say somebody else's assumptions may be much more clear to you. Your assumptions may be much more clear to somebody else than they are to you. Is that clear why?
Because you're stuck in them.
Yeah, but because you are getting pleasure out of them, you want to defend them, right? The other person may not get pleasure out of that assumption, right? He may get pleasure out of another assumption, right? So, therefore, if the group is varied, then you have the possibility of people, as it were, coming from different subcultures. You see, our assumptions are mainly cultural. I don't know if that has come out so far. We don't really make them personally, very few of them. Huh? We may modify them a little bit. Each one picks his own assumptions. But you see, there's a Greek word, idiosyncrasy, a Greek-rooted word, which means private mixture in Greek. And the idea is that there's a large number of assumptions floating around in society, and each person makes a somewhat different mixture of his own, which he then defends as his own, right? But primarily, almost all of our assumptions come from the culture, you see. And each culture is divided into subcultures which have different assumptions, which they either don't meet or they argue or fight about them, right? And you see now, these assumptions and cultures are generally non-negotiable. You see, like between East and West, right? The basic assumptions of Eastern society and Western society are not negotiable in any way at all, right? That means there's no way really to solve, to get together, right? Except on trivial details, superficial details, right? Are you going to increase the rate of armament at this rate or at another rate? You see, you cut the number of nuclear weapons in half, but you'll still have enough to destroy everything 10 times over, or 100 times over, or whatever it is. And so you can't really. Those assumptions are so rigid that they're not negotiable. Now, most cultures, their cultural differences are not really negotiable. You see, either they will fight over them or they will ignore each other, right? Or else they will politely agree to disagree or whatever.
When you are in dialogue and you don't have a fixed subject or agenda, or you don't have a problem to solve, what then becomes a content, and how does that move?
Well, the content then becomes free, you see, according to the interests of whoever is there. See, there will be a content at each moment. It may last a while and it may shift, it moves in a free and creative way.
Why would people even come to such gatherings when there is no problem?
Yes, but you have illustrated the assumption of our culture, right? That it's no use getting together unless you have some purpose. You see, let me give one of the theories of some anthropologists who have studied hunter-gatherer cultures at the Stone Age, such as the Eskimos and the American Indians, and at least during an earlier time when there was some remnant of that. And they say that they're usually groups of about 20 to 40 people. Less than 20 can't survive, and more than 40 is unmanageable. And what they do is they get together in a circle and just talk, right? Perhaps at night they have a fire, right? And they talk apparently to no purpose. They're just talking and talking. And so it ends having made no decisions. But they seem then to know what to do. You see, they may form smaller groups for doing it, whatever it may be, but it seems to be essential that they should have this open space, this completely undetermined, unoccupied space in which to communicate. Now, that seems to have a very beneficial effect on the whole. It means everybody really knows everybody in some way, if there are not too many people. And so, according to that view, the human race has evolved for hundreds of thousands of years in that state, and our present state is a rather recent thing, right? Maybe it started 10,000 years ago, when we went from hunter-gatherer to agriculture and to industry, and the groups got too large to be handled that way, and you had to set up hierarchical authority, right? Which meant fixed assumptions and no discussion and no dialogue, right? So, therefore, the hierarchical society has no place for dialogue, really. The family, for example, is a hierarchical structure, right? Especially in the old days, the patriarchal family, you can't imagine a dialogue, right? And the family structure was apparently much looser in the hunter-gatherer stage, you see. So well, all of this, you can say maybe the opinions of anthropologists, but there seems to be something behind it. And but in any case, it's an interesting thing to think about, that perhaps our present structure of society is only the result of recent assumptions. It seems plausible. And that there's no real necessity behind it at all, other than the fact that we're assuming it, right?
Maybe the success of Japanese company management, working somewhat similarly as you described, at least at one level of it.
Yeah, but they still are very hierarchical.
Otherwise they are.
Yeah, you see, they don't have that freedom, and they do have somewhat more of a together feeling, you see, but a different assumption about that. So what can I say? That to have a dialogue, we have a group in which there is no hierarchy. You see, now you can see how difficult it is once we get stuck in our present society to get you see, there's a certain difficulty in getting out of this structure that we're in, right? Because first of all, we all come, whatever subculture we come from, it is very likely that it contains the assumption it's no use getting together unless we have a purpose. And you will then, that is not merely a verbal assumption, but it is part of our disposition, right? From very early childhood, and you will feel it. You see, you will feel very frustrated at having no purpose. What?
Especially the Westerner.
Mm-hmm. You see, it feels much better to have a purpose, right? So the old brain getting good feelings says, tells the new brain we must have a purpose, right?
But in the other hand, this kind of behavior makes one very isolated, because to come together for purpose, it's very rare for coming together for good purpose. And one doesn't want to get involved, so it becomes isolated. Because without purpose, we are not used to getting together anymore.
No.
So then one becomes isolated.
Yes, well, we don't know what to do, you see.
Yeah.
It becomes uncertain what to do, and that produces unpleasant feelings in the old brain.
Yeah.
And also frustrating, because you say, I know what to do when there's a purpose, now I don't know what to do. Right?
Yeah.
But then think of the hunter-gatherer groups who didn't seem to require a purpose to get together. At least no visible one, right?
Would you say that when people get together for purely social reasons, that fulfills any of
No, because you see, what we usually call social reasons consists of relaxation and entertainment is the purpose, you see. So see, either we get together to carry out a function or to relaxation and entertainment. You see, now the dialogue will not be relaxing or entertaining. It may even be frustrating and produce tension at first, and it does not fulfill a function. You see, we're ready to face frustration if we say at least some function will be done, right?
Yeah.
What's the point? People want to know what is the point?
What is the point? Yes, you see. So therefore, we have to discuss that. What is the point?
It seems to me if there's no direction, and then that has an effect on how one would enter into it, how the thought would proceed from that.
Yes, you see that once we have an assumption, that assumption takes power, right? And therefore you don't have free play. The free play is limited, right? See, the creative intelligence is not compatible with any fixed assumption, right? Although we do need relatively fixed assumptions when we carry out a function, right? But we need an open space where there aren't any. You see, like we can call it leisure. The word leisure means in Latin, it seems to have a root meaning emptiness, empty space or unoccupied, right? So individually, all sorts of people have said we need to have the mind empty and unoccupied for some period, right? But that you can't keep it occupied all the time, right? It must be empty and open for some period to heal itself. But now, suggesting that for the group this is necessary too. In other words, society, the culture will heal itself.
It seems to be kind of, maybe I'm not understanding this, but a kind of a catch-22 in the situation of just a dialogue that seems to have no purpose other than the actual dialogue. I mean, how do you get together?
Well, that's right. We're saying we don't. I'm really proposing. You see, I'm trying to say we're looking at thought, right? We're using thought to make a proposal. We're not yet making any assumption of what to do, right? Now, can we explore this proposal? We're saying it's not clear what to do. You see, it's also was not clear to Newton what to do about whatever he was doing, right?
Are you also proposing at this time that group getting together, such as here in the school, the teachers come together and try to have insight into education? Are you proposing it's quite a unsuccessful endeavor?
Well, no, dialogue can. I'm not, and we mustn't. I don't think we should set up perfectionist ideals. We're saying merely, you may find as you start that you don't do this perfectly, right? But we want to look at what is the proposal of the essential idea, right? Rather than be limited by what we happen to be able to do at this moment. We have to see, and then we can ask why can't we do, if this is a good idea, why can't we carry it out?
So we're really looking at this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unless a group has been informed of what you have just informed us, in our culture, If you could even start, we'll say, with a question to try and keep the thing open, but because other people don't know about this, you would immediately get yourself a big set of assumptions, and then we're off to the races.
Yes, what we're saying, exploring, could, I don't know if this group is not going to stay together long enough that we can explore a little bit, you see. But suppose there were other groups, you see, I'm saying we're not committing ourselves to do anything, even right now. You see, we're saying we're interested in what is the truth of the matter. And therefore that the mind must be open, there must be an empty space without fixed assumptions, right?
We're not committing ourselves in any direction.
No, and we don't have to do anything, we don't have to achieve anything as a result of our discussion, or, we are merely talking.
One of the things you hear so much now is like setting goals. Whenever you do anything, you have to set a goal. Where does that fit into this?
Well, that fits in more limited actions. You see, if I want to do anything which is defined as simple as going home or wherever, going to a house, I assume I have the assumption or the conclusion that I'm going to go there, and I go, right? But I'm saying that if all activities are goal-directed, then we cannot really explore our assumptions. But we do need to explore our assumptions. You see, suppose you're by yourself, let's say, forget the group, and saying, I need space to meditate, right? To have an open mind, whatever way that means to you. And I say, I must have a purpose as I do this, you see. Well, wouldn't there be trouble?
What if you were to...
There's a contradiction.
What if you were to try to meditate on your assumptions?
All right, I can meditate on whatever interests me, but if my purpose is fixed, you see, I might discover as I meditate on my assumptions that there's another question that's more important behind it, right? Yeah. So therefore I can't say I fix my purpose as meditating on my assumptions. I'll start out meditating on my assumptions. That's my proposal, right?
Okay, yeah, so you have the proposal and then you just start from there and let it go.
Yeah. But I haven't turned that proposal into an assumption, you see.
Well, the group could start that way too, couldn't they, with a dialogue? Just saying,
Yeah.
let's just start out this way, just to get something going.
That's right. We can propose anything and carry it as far as we like, drop it whenever we like it. We're not required to succeed at anything. And we're exploring the proposal. It might lead to another proposal. Right? It might lead to the idea nobody cares about this at all, let's try something else.
How would you maintain an interest on the part of the participants in the dialogue? For me, it would be being a Westerner, goal-oriented, etc. I'd say, what is the point of what they're saying? Where is this leading? How does my Western mind, which is used to going from A to B to C, or what have you, with something, follow it if it's very random?
Yeah. Well, then we'll discuss. We're starting a dialogue now and saying, see, I will take you're arguing from the Western mind, and I say, let's question the Western mind, right? It's not absolutely necessary. And I'm saying, apparently there have been other kinds of mind where this problem wouldn't have arisen, right? And therefore, can we question this Western mind and say, what is the source of interest? You see, is it a particular goal, or perhaps the exploration of this whole thing? I realize that if we cannot dialogue, human race, civilization cannot be maintained, and the human race may not even be viable, right? That if people, see, if we can't really talk to each other, and in talking in this way, at first there will be a lot of frustration and boredom, and people will confront each other. All these problems are going to arise, right? But if we can stay with it and get beyond that, then you will find a kind of friendship develops which is not based on personal acquaintance, right?
Isn't there the danger that could become the purpose for the dialogue, though?
What?
Will there be development of friendship or
Yes,
saving?
well, but you don't know what it is. You see, you have to be careful. I'm saying that's why you have to be careful about on that. So that might come out as a byproduct, you see. But you see, the fundamental reason is that if we start from the way we are, human relationship is basically not really possible. You see, that's one reason you could give. You see, or you could say, this whole thing doesn't mean anything to me. Let's try something else. You know. But it's serious enough to maintain it in spite of frustration and boredom. You see, if somebody really wants to do so, say such a simple thing as making money, you see, he may expect to continue to work, though he may be frustrated, he may be uncertain about the results, and he may often get quite bored, right? But he regards that as so important that he keeps at it, right? Now, I would say that in some sense this dialogue is so important that it is worth keeping at.
What about a lack of basic trust in relationships?
Yeah, I'm proposing that this dialogue will get at that.
Yeah, right.
And that we begin with lack of trust because we all have different assumptions, and we know each one will stick to his assumption and defend it, and therefore you can't trust the person, right? So, see, for example, between America and Russia, it would be inconceivable that there could be trust because their assumptions are so different, right? Now, each one must mistrust the other.
That's an assumption, isn't it?
What?
Isn't that an assumption
What?
too? That we must mistrust?
No, I'm saying, given the assumptions which exist, that mistrust is inevitable. Without those assumptions, it may not be. It may be quite possible to have trust, right?
Knowing that's the dialogue. I mean, if you know that your assumptions are there, that you only speak from the assumptions, you have to suspend it. I mean,
Yeah. See, if we can suspend our assumptions, we will gradually begin to see that trust is possible. But you cannot trust somebody who will not suspend his assumptions. It would be unreasonable to trust somebody of that kind, right?
Saying that this could have a healing effect on society.
On the culture, yeah.
On the culture. And looking around as you do and seeing that immediately, perhaps no one in this room except you might have suggested doing this.
Well,
I'm
other
not
people
saying
have
it's true, I'm
suggested
just
it,
saying
but
perhaps.
yeah.
Would you say then, and if it were that important, and if we were to do this, would then the ball be in our court as responsible for being the ones who might also suggest it? Because perhaps if you looked around in the whole world, you might not find a group that would see dialogue as a value or anything.
Yeah, there might be only a few or somewhere.
So it's rather unique, isn't it? Is it unique?
Well, it's not unique, but I mean, there are other people who see this, you see, but it's not there are people who see it in some limited way of dialogue, using dialogue for certain purposes, like better relations in wherever they're doing, which has its value. But I'm proposing that this is only part of something much greater. Yeah, you see, we don't want to denigrate the notion of using dialogue to get better relations in wherever you're working, you see, but saying that is only part of the thing. And that the thing that is much greater is that there can be a dialogue which is not attached to any purpose or function or task or problem. But if we don't manage to do that at the moment, we still don't get discouraged. We may find we have got it, but at least we know that that's something that's important, right?
What we bring to such gatherings, not our assumptions, but our proposals.
Well, we will also bring our assumptions, you see, we can't help it.
Yeah, but, all right, but we say that at the beginning or sometimes during the initial stages, we would suspend that.
If we could, but sometimes they wouldn't be suspendable, and people would confront each other, you see. Now, usually in a confrontation, nothing good can happen. You see, the old brain of each person gets terribly stirred up and becomes very defensive about the assumptions, right? The more one person holds his assumptions, the more the other person does, right? So it's very hard for two people, even who understand all this, in a confrontation to get out of it. So is that clear? Now, in a group it's easier, it can be easier, it can be harder or easier, but a group may be very frightening at first, the larger the group, because it may be like a mob, you see. It could be different, you see, we have all sorts of assumptions about large groups which could frighten us, right? And also knowledge about the very bad way in which large groups can behave, you know, like Nazi Germany and so on, you know, in which people are compelled, in which the whole view, the hierarchy view is imposed, right, by one leader. Or else they just break up in a mob, you see. So this is something which, at least in modern times, has not been common, which is to have a group which would be friendly, intelligent, not a mob, and which would be in which people could really trust each other, and in which there would be this freedom of communication. Now that's a proposal, you see, which we could explore. You see, whether we can really bring it about quickly, I wouldn't say. You see, it may take, you know, quite a bit of work to really bring this about.
Would it be something like an intelligent brainstorming?
Well, more than that, because there would be, I think, the development of a new mind, which was common, you see. A common pool of meaning. That in this flow of meaning, everybody's participating in it, you see. And therefore, in some sense, though the individual is always free, he's never compelled to think in a certain way, but is participating in this common mind, right? Which may have in some way a higher intelligence than the individual. I'm proposing that is something we could explore.
You said a lot of work. What do you mean by a lot of work?
Well, you have to keep at it to sustain the work. You see, it will be very discouraging at first. You see, well, probably if we tried it, we might find in the beginning it was rather interesting and people would be fairly polite and so on. And then gradually, either it would get a bit boring or people would start confronting each other, or both, and you would begin to get discouraged, right? It might take quite a while going through this before you got beyond it.
That's what we're doing now.
Well, we have begun, you see, but we haven't. See, for example, we have not yet faced a confrontation, a serious confrontation, right? You see, if there is such a confrontation, then if the group is really united, or working in this way, then it can sort of come in and diffuse it and enable us all to look at the mechanics of that confrontation. You see, we said how hard it is to see the connection between the assumption and the feeling, right? In the group, it's transparent, you see, because it's happening publicly and privately, you see. Whatever is happening to the other person, you can feel it happening to you, right? But you also can see the words come out and see directly the relation of the words and the reaction. So therefore, in a sense, you could say the opportunity exists for seeing this thing. Now, the group can explore all the sort of questions that the individual might explore. It can explore other questions besides.
Well, I believe that our group, 6, got into this. We started out with what seemed to be a reasonable thing, and in nothing flat, we were in the middle of a heavy intellectual comparison that, you know, this has read a book, we read a book, everybody's read a book. And one member very soon got tired of this and said, and had us see what we were doing. And so we immediately dropped it and got on to the subject matter, which was what is the self.
Mm-hmm.
All right? Now I think that I'm not preening our feathers at all, more than a little. But in other words, I think we did something right.
Yes, see, now in the larger group this is harder. You see, one of the points is that in a small group people can all get sort of to know each other and they adapt to each other, and very often they don't get into these confrontations because they sort of have a feeling for what is going to produce them, and they avoid them, right? Now, in a large group this is much harder, and in time you can't manage it, right? If the group gets beyond 20 or so. That the thing is going to, it may start to polarize, as we saw, for example, in the group 2 weeks ago. And, or there may be a confrontation between individuals, but this often turns into a polarization of groups, right? Of subgroups. And therefore, the point is to be able to get through that. You see, I think that if you could stay with this and really work it through, that you would then have a group that was able to handle assumptions and discuss and be free, you see, and would have this kind of mind.
It seems that we need to propose something to move on. Somebody needs to propose something.
What?
What? It seems we're around the edge of what the dialogue is. And not
well, we're just discussing some features of the dialogue so far, right, to sort of bring it out.
Isn't there one other feature that you brought up before, having to do with in the group, in dialogue, to just talk in a very straight way, to work towards speaking in an unmediated fashion?
Yes, you see that? Direct. You see, the point is, perhaps we'll try to discuss that next time. We have to start talking directly to each other, you see. You see, in other words, we have started with me as the center, and you're talking through me most of the time. Right? Well, that was probably inevitable, but see, can we reach a stage where that becomes less and less important? Not to say you're going to avoid it, but to say it comes about, that becomes less and less important, right? Now, you see, the circular form is the right form for that. See, if you put people in rows, very hard, right? Now, we unfortunately would get too big to make one single circle. It's as near as we can get to have several of them. But say if you had 20 people, you could probably put them in a single circle, right? Now, and there in a circular structure, it's possible for there to be a direct line between any person and any other person. Whereas you see, if you have everybody in rows and somebody addressing them, then it's almost inevitable. You see, most of the people who are inside have very little possibility of directly relating to each other. Right? You see, it's the people in these various rows. You see, somebody is in the back row, somebody else is in the front row. And they are very hard to talk to each other, right? So they're mostly talking to the speaker. Well, that's the purpose of that arrangement. But you see, so the circular arrangement is the right one. It's the one that was used by all these hunter-gatherers. And so the point is that, will it be possible for you to start, at least to some extent, talking directly to each other? And I come in. Ideally, we could I say I should come in to facilitate, or, eventually to make my job unnecessary. Right?
In small groups, I think there was more of a straight talking.
Yeah, but the thing to notice is how much harder it is to do in the large group. But
intimidating.
Yes, we have assumptions about the large group, which are intimidating. Right?
What are they?
Well, that's something we might discuss. I think it's about time, it's 6:45 already. Perhaps we could start up again tomorrow and try as we go along to really turn it into a dialogue. But I might later come back and give a presentation of some sort. So, in other words, that we won't probably not make it entirely dialogue, unless it turns out that's exactly what you want to do, right? In other words, it's not fixed. Saying every one of these weekends has been different. We've had throughout different parts of the world about 7 already, and each one has gone differently, and it cannot be predicted.